give a little bit of background on Jessica before we get started. Jessica is an amazing astrologer, writer, and cultural commentator, and she brings to light the spiritual underpinnings that shape both the personal and collective experience of our time. In her private practice, Jessica draws from her knowledge of many metaphysical traditions to provide her clients with a sense of the big picture. Her readers and students are given an understanding of how they might respond rather than merely reacting to these turbulent times. Jessica trained as a fine artist before graduating in 1973 from Brown University, where she studied Jungian psychology and linguistics. After a few years in a political theatre troupe, Jessica began a study of the symbolic language of archetypes and has been practicing and teaching astrology in San Francisco for 35 years. Now, there are not many websites that I follow religiously, but this is one that I watch all of the time. It's Jessica's mothersky.com. That's mothersky.com. And you can also check out Jessica's fascinating blogs, her two books that I recommend, Soul Sick Nation and At the Crossroads. And I was saying to Maureen the other day that I read about 5 books a week, and I have done for a long, long time. And Jessica's two books are literally the most gripping and valuable I've ever had my hands on. Well, Jessica, welcome to our show.
Wow. Thank you very much. It's lovely to hear you.
You too. I'm so excited, Jessica, to have you on this show. I've told you before, I follow your work very, very closely, and
That's
just have a
lovely.
huge amount of respect for you. Well,
Thank you
Jessica, the
so
first
much.
thing I want to ask you about is this Uranus-Pluto square that we're all hearing about, that's
hmm
peaking right now, and wanted to ask you to explain that to us a little, please.
Wow. Well, it's got all the astrologers all hopped up, so you can't find any of us who don't think about it all the time. It's really the main event. And perhaps the biggest deal since the mid-60s, which is, we link it in terms of a cycle to what was going on in the mid-60s when there was this huge time of revolt that was really worldwide, rapid reform and intensity and upheaval. And so what we have now, which is peaking between this 2012 and 2015, are the most intense years, is a meeting of the planet of revolution, that's Uranus, and the planet of breakdown, which is Pluto. And those two represent cosmic forces which, are in the process of targeting the institutions in our world and the consciousnesses in our world that need it, that need to be shaken up. So I always want to qualify it for people that, it's not just, something to be afraid of, earthquakes are coming, terrible disasters and revolutions. I think one is being asked here to make a leap of faith that is based on the premise that the cosmic forces are only going to target what needs it. Nothing is going to break down that still has viability. But if there are, certain industries, the financial industry that was, the first famous, notorious example of the square, if there's corruption in a government or an industry, then we're going to see it. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. It really does. I always remember, Jessica, in my reading with you, which I listen to regularly, you said that the planets somehow reflect what needs to occur.
hmm Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a school of astrology that would call itself transpersonal, which is more of the spiritual philosophy behind what we're talking about, which is an assumption that the extreme conditions that humanity is experiencing right now are symptomatic of a situation that needs healing. And that's the reason it's happening. So when we approach these intense events, and 2013 is going to be very intense, we can try, I think, to look at it in a value-neutral way, to not think of it as good or bad, but just about creative disruption so that healing can happen and our complacency can be shaken up in the places where it needs to be shaken up.
Well, Jessica, I want to ask you this question. If the planets reflect what needs to happen, do you feel that if as societies we took greater responsibility for delivering change that needed to occur, that we could avert certain happenings?
Oh, yes. I'm not the kind of astrologer who believes in prediction. I don't think that anything is fated in that sense. What is
Okay.
fated, if you will, is the intensity of healing that wants to happen and the cosmic lessons that are going to be taught. But what isn't predictable is whether or not we'll learn. So everything depends on what, as you say, the capacity to have our consciousnesses in the right place. And that isn't written in the stars. That's up to us.
So we can take responsibility
I
and
would like to say that there's a huge difference that we would all be well to meditate on between responsibility and reactivity. And what we get so often when the mass mind is freaking out is reaction. But the old-fashioned notion of responsibility, which is, of course, no more or less than the ability to respond, has kind of gone out of favor. I talk about this a lot in both of my books, this notion of responsibility, which used to be an earmark of maturity. I say used to be because it's, I believe, a collective value that has changed over the centuries. There's no longer, the sense that one wants to build a character by having self-knowledge and a restrained response to something. There's more reactivity, and the whole word responsibility now has kind of devolved into the idea of blame. We say, oh, I'm not responsible for, the president's drone program, which really is, we're trying to say, it's not my fault. But if we went back to this original idea, the ability to respond, and to respond from our inner being, then we would be in a different place.
it's interesting that you say that because, well, obviously I'm British and I live in the US. I love living in the US. It's a great honor to be here, but I see some of the cultural differences. And one of the things that struck me in the
Mm-hmm.
presidential campaign was the amount of blame that
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as though everything that had ever gone wrong or happened in 4 years was only President Obama's fault. So I'm not
Mm-hmm.
trying to be political, but I believe that I'm responsible or we're responsible.
Yes, that's right. I mean, in astrology, it's very explicit. The symbols, the planet Saturn is the symbol of responsibility. And it's also known as karma, which means that I'm aware of the consequences. And the more you take this idea seriously, because we're each born with a Saturn in our chart, which is to say that we each have the potential to evolve through this archetype of responsibility. It's not just given to some people and not to others. But, in our own style, we have the choice to either become responsible or not. And to really take it seriously means that it isn't just actions. It's the notion of being responsible for the energy that you put out in thought and in spirit as well as in deed. And you don't hear many people talking about that in the public discussion, as you say. That the whole thing is so rigged and really quite silly that the official narrative has been, it's really much more telling, I think, for what it doesn't say than for what it does say. And everybody's running around acting like little children with this blaming thing, like you say. In astrology, there is a very significant transit called the Saturn return. You probably know about it. And everybody gets it when they're 3 decades old, and then again 3 decades from then. And it's Saturn. It's the cycle of Saturn, meaning that you are considered an astrological grown-up if you learn that what you put out there has something to do with you, if you learn the lesson of responsibility. And, the whole culture that we live in now, and much of the Western world, too, which copies our American culture and our values, is completely out to lunch on this.
It's fascinating. Well, I want to use an example from your book, Jessica, at the Crossroads, to ask you another question about the Uranus-Pluto square. Because I
Yeah,
remember when I started reading your work, thinking, wow, this lady is a world-class astrologer, but I also thought, wow, this lady has a world-class sense of humor.
that's
And
good to hear.
I remember I couldn't put the book down, and it was Saturday night. It was about 3 a.m. I was still reading it, and I read and you possibly don't remember this because you write a lot, but you made a reference to piggy bank, and you said you were talking about the banking scandals, and
Yeah,
you said something to the effect of, well, it brings a whole new meaning to the term piggy bank.
piggy banks, right? Piggy
Yeah,
bankers.
I just love it. I have a note actually on my task list to go through your book and pick out the most striking sentences and things. So I want to ask you about the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Hmm.
Was that part of the Uranus-Pluto square?
Well, astrologers just see that as the quintessential expression of Uranus and Pluto, partly because Uranus is in Aries, which governs activism, not just thinking revolutionary thoughts, but really putting yourself on the line. And Occupy Wall Street was so emphatically about that. Most of them have a lot of money, and it wasn't about going through official channels and waiting and having the PAC, the super PAC funds to influence politicians. It was about going downtown and putting your ass on the line, your physical body. And I just, the timing of it was so perfect from the point of view of when the Uranus-Pluto square, which goes in and out of orb, kind of waxes and wanes, when it was peaking. And Pluto really, it won't surprise people who listen to language to hear that Pluto governs plutocracy. But the Occupy Wall Street movement was really the first time anybody said that aloud. The fact that the U.S. is plutocracy, which literally in the dictionary means that a tiny little group of people
Hmm.
controls most of the wealth. And so the Occupy Wall Street movement put that into the national conversation, and as we know, it spread like wildfire across the globe and became international because it touched a nerve. It expressed what the transit was about in the most essential terms.
Well, I want to ask you, Jessica, about 2013
Hmm.
because we know that, as you said, astrologically, it's got to be a challenging and more eventful year. And I've been following very closely the events in the Middle East. I just find it fascinating to look not only at the history of the Middle East, but the
Yes.
dynamics of the Middle East with Iran and Israel,
Hmm.
Palestine, Syria, and more. And I want to ask you about energy because the debate about energy and becoming energy independent was really huge in the presidential election.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I wanted to ask your view about oil and nuclear energy and this sort of transition from the industrial age.
That's right.
What's happening there?
I think 2013 is a turning point with that huge issue. And I want to start with your question about the way the campaign in the USA treated it, which was so, it was interesting from an astrological point of view. It was dreadful from the point of view of truth and campaigning. But what I was interested in was the various phases of Pluto, which is so strong in the sky right now in this transit you're talking about. Pluto governs taboo and unmentionables, and kind of there being a subtext, like the elephant in the middle of the room and nobody's identifying it. And there's a taboo energy around oil here, in the sense that, I guess the most obvious sense was that in none of the campaigns did any of the politicians mention the big picture about the dependence on oil, that it's a dead end. Everybody knows it. The world is running out of oil, but instead they talk about gas prices and promising to lower them and all this nonsense, which are really distortions of the truth. Because as you may know, gas prices are a complete political red herring. The domestic drilling has nothing to do with gas prices because it's a world market. It's world output that counts here. The maximum amount of oil that could possibly be recovered through offshore drilling, in other words, is minuscule. And the interesting thing is that they bought it. So much of the electorate went for this drill, baby drill line, which I think was just unconscionable because every one of those politicians knew that it is sold on the international market. It has nothing to do, the price of gas at the pump has nothing to do with where it's drilled.
I remember being horrified, Jessica, reading an article only, I think, 3 months ago, something like that, an article about how wonderful it was that the Russians were able to ship fuel through part of the Arctic Circle that's melted, basically, and they can now
Oh,
get much
God.
more easily to their fuel to Asia, and that's a good thing. That
Right,
the Arctic's
right,
melting, great for business.
right.
It's terrible.
So I think that there is a combination here of deliberate manipulation. Pluto governs propaganda. And since this transit, the propaganda has gotten more blatant, more fevered, with public opinion being really based on a deliberate distortion of truth about the gas and diesel production thing. And then this business of hiding the elephant in the middle of the room, the idea that dependence on oil is an economic dead end, not to mention, as you say, a climate disaster, and has everything to do with war. So it's a perennial threat to national security for people who are worried about that angle. And we can't go anywhere with it. So it's a stalling device that I guess is there to feed the dinosaurs, the last institutions that are making money off of it, while holding the whole world hostage. So many people in the, looking at new ways that we're going to use, what kind of energy we're going to have to use when the oil is gone. When I think of, people use the word alternative for it, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? Because it's going to be the norm. And we're just putting it off, trying to research it. We could do it, of course. We could run the world on clean energy sources in 2 weeks, I think, if we put our will to it.
Wow, in 2 weeks.
Well, when you think of the ingenuity that's out there, and the fact that these clean energy solutions have been already tried, there's been experimentation for decades now, and have been found to work very well, and yet the way the system is structured, the industrial age would die overnight without oil because of the infrastructure. So if we put all the genius, all the scientific know-how to unmask the truth that oil is a dead end If we put all the geniuses of the world and the technological opinion meisters to work, yes, I think it could be done very, very quickly.
Goodness. Well, Jessica, I want to ask you about the media for a moment as well, because I was reading that the ownership of the media over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years has changed dramatically. And there's been a lot of consolidation, and that
Right.
concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
Another cultural observation was when I moved to the States, I would switch the TV off because and I know it's a problem all over the world. It's not just, I'm not picking on the US, but it's like a fog machine. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem to give me the clarity of understanding about what's really happening in the world that astrology can provide, or looking at your work, for example. So, what are
Mm.
your observations about the media and the correlation between what the way our media functions and
Mm-hmm.
the problems that we have in the world, and how that fits with the whole Uranus-Pluto square?
Right. Well, I think this is very distressing. The idea of a poisoned stream of media. And you can see in the chart of the USA the indication that there will be a pollution. This is Pluto, which in the chart of the USA, which is to say the entity that was born, quote unquote, July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia, we can do the chart of a group entity and understand something of the group karma from it. This is what I do in my first book, Soul Sick Nation. We can see in there this Pluto opposed to Mercury, which governs the media, and infer from it that there's a lot of experimentation that starts in the American moneyed classes with this deliberate manipulation of public opinion that I was talking about earlier. And it's not, of course, exclusively American, but it's been raised to an art form in the American media. And the consolidation of power, as you say, is very, very troubling. You may know that when television was just a little baby new medium, it was thought of, it was really envisioned by the earliest visionaries as being a public service thing. And then it has morphed into utterly a commercial venture. So the idea of even the news becoming infotainment, and then in a situation like Fox News, which is the most extreme example of this phenomenon, it's just out and out propaganda now. So I think that people who are interested in keeping their sanity and, maybe growing their consciousness during times this intense have a really fine line to walk. And there's an interesting transit, Stephen, that's going on this year from Jupiter in Gemini this spring, right now. Between Jupiter in Gemini and the Pisces planets, it's a symbolic representation of the exact fine line we're talking about, which is between being open to what's going on in the world, not shutting down, not running under the bed to hide. Between that, staying self-informed, and then on the other hand, being overwhelmed by how toxic it is. I don't have a television. Like you say, you just want to shut it off when you realize the mendacity that's going on and the lack of clean information. But this fine line is part of our responsibility, I think, as not just citizens, but human beings who are alive during these times. Because we're children of our era as much as we're children of a country. And I think our responsibility has to do with finding clean streams of media and keeping open to them, not shutting down.
Yeah, and it seems to me that there's this theme of purity, purity of
Mm-hmm.
purpose, purity of fuel, of information. The word purity just
Mm-hmm.
comes to mind. Now, I know, Jessica, that traditionally we consider Neptune to be the ruler of oil, but your
Yeah.
view is that Pluto actually rules oil. So I want to ask you, you were talk explaining about the US natal charts going back to the 1700s, and you mentioned the
Hmm.
Saturn return phenomena earlier. The US
Hmm.
is going to have a Pluto return. So
Yeah,
I'm intrigued to ask you about that because for me that's just it's huge, and it somehow feels intertwined with this whole theme of oil and fuel and
yeah,
need for purity.
right. Because the whole notion of Pluto is lack of purity. And of course, in nature, there are there are forms of Plutonian devolution that are utterly organic. It just governs decay. So Pluto is the process that's working on the moldy orange in your fruit basket. That's part of nature. It just breaks it down so it can turn into a whole new form. But in the human realm, Plutonian decay um, takes the form very often of corruption and the kind of pollution that we are steeped in now. Although the good news is that with Uranus squaring Pluto, there is a very steep learning curve. Flashes of insight are hitting a lot of people at once about the nature of corruption. So we're waking up to the presence of this decay and corruption, and that's actually the good news. But it's certainly in our face. And one of the examples of this plutonian corruption is we were talking about earlier, this unmentionability of oil, the real truth behind the oil wars, the role that oil has played in these hideous, unnecessary, toxic wars that the U.S. Pentagon has been waging. So that is a more Plutonian exercise than anyone is willing to admit. The whole notion of an oil war, Stephen, we didn't have this in earlier generations. This is a new peculiarity of our age. So as you say, the intertwinement of oil, this addiction we've developed in the machine age to this one black goop, which is interesting. It's made of decay, right? So it's
Hmm.
Plutonian through and through. There's so many levels of the Pluto symbolism in it. And the other is the propaganda that we talked about. Pluto governs that too. And then there's nuclear energy, which is a very dicey topic, I think. It's, Uranus is uranium, of course. Pluto is plutonium. And nuclear energy is being discussed in a whole new heated way now that Pluto and Uranus are dominating the transits. You remember that dreadful quake tsunami that happened in Japan. That would happen the very day that Uranus hit the Aries point.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's like I was think of astrology, Jessica, as it's like watching a clock, the hands of a clock moving
That's
around and
right.
ticking into place. It's just mind blowing.
It really is. That's exactly what it is, and no more than that either. People, have the mistaken idea, I think, that the planets make something happen. But what it's really going on is just as you say, that they're just a clock. They just show us what time it is.
If we're conscious.
Right. It's like the full moon is a bright light, literally and figuratively. So that is such a good example, the lunar cycle, because everybody is aware of it, and we can see more blatantly how it's a clock, and how in the new moon, which is what we're just going into now, this month, tomorrow, Saturday night, we have the beginning of a cycle, and then 2 weeks later we have the culmination of the cycle when everything is lit up. And the symbolic way that it's lit up means that things come to a head and we can see. So the potential for consciousness is very high at the full moon.
And now Neptune is in Pisces. I
Right.
remember reading that in the 1800s, Neptune was in Pisces. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, but my
Hmm.
understanding is that when we had this huge
Yeah.
explosion of spiritualism and
Yes, exactly.
psychic phenomena, seances, that was when Neptune was in Pisces. And here we are again, Neptune in
Yeah,
Pisces.
that's right. It only happens once every 168 years, and it's a very big deal. And you may also know that we've got all these planets in water, not just Neptune, this
You read my
year.
mind. I was going to say to you, aren't there something like 6 or 7 planets in Pisces
There's
in
going to be
February?
a lot of planets right now. We have Saturn in the North Node in Scorpio, and from middle of this month through the middle of next month, we're going to have half of the solar system's going to be in Pisces, 5 out of 10 planets. And then in
Gosh.
July, Jupiter will go into Cancer, which is the third water sign.
Well,
So
Jessica, we're
everything
going.
about the importance of water is up. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
Well, I wanted to say to you, Jessica, we're going to take a very short commercial break, but
Hmm.
after that, I would like to ask you about this whole theme of Pisces and what it means for people that have a lot of Piscean energy
Yeah,
just after this short break.
okay.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at psychicaccess.com.
Well, Jessica, welcome back after the break. I wanted to ask you more, Jessica, about this theme of water, because as you said, Pisces is a water sign. There are a large number of planets in Pisces. What does this mean for people that have a lot of Piscean energy in their personal charts or psyches?
Well, they could be in their glory. It depends, as always, on how we use what we have, but the potential is for people who are already sensitive to water and who kind of run that energy as their native state to deepen their understanding of what makes them tick. Because it's as if the outer environment now is supporting, especially strongly, who they are inside. And this is an important point because water, of all the 4 elements, is the one that's least understood, I think, in the modern world because of, the way that humanity in our times is kind of skeptical about things that they can't see, to the point of, not having a clue about such things as psychic impact, and even the emotional realm is given short shrift. So it becomes very important to make use of a period like 2013, where, especially this spring, February and March, when there's so much Pisces affecting everybody, and the people who already are used to water, it's a familiar place for them to be. Emotional sensitivity and psychic receptivity can, I would hope, feel more validated. They're the ones who have something to teach the rest of us.
Yeah, not on this theme of purity and
Hmm.
sensitivity, sensitive to the planet, sensitive to resources, sensitive to each other, sensitive to integrity.
Hmm. The whole emotional realm, it's kind of nice to see psychologists finally talking in terms of emotional intelligence. Don't know if you've noticed that, but when I was learning psychology, years ago, nobody talked about emotional intelligence. Intelligence was, strictly speaking, a mental phenomenon. And in astrology, we would say it was given over to air. Air is pure cognitive thought. But these days, for them to concede officially that there could be such a thing as emotional intelligence is the kind of thinking and awareness I think that people are getting more and more hip to. They're getting more and more hip to what water is. And it's happening physically. On the physical level, people are going to be, I think, all year more sensitized to the pollution of our waterways and the scarcity of clean drinking water, and all these really unprecedented crises that are happening because of global warming, such as rising sea levels. This is not something that human beings are already equipped to deal with. We have to dig inside of ourselves and come up with a response.
Well, I want to ask you, Jessica, on this subject of purity, about some of the dreadful events we've seen in the US, the shootings we've seen, and my understanding, and can you correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that Uranus does govern shootings. Is that correct?
Did you say Uranus?
Yes.
It's all really shocking, sudden events.
Okay.
So anything that shocks the pants off of the public, we expect to see it during the square. Yeah.
But you see,
and in
we
Aries,
see
which
again, we see
is
these events
associated with
on the
violence.
television and in the media, and for me, the it's like a canary dying in a mine.
Right.
They are signs that something is seriously wrong. So I want
Yeah.
to ask you about the people who are losing control of themselves, of their emotions, but I also want to ask you about, again, about purity and integrity, but particularly regarding the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah. A drug thing is very, very interesting, on so many levels. You know that Neptune governs drugs. It governs
Yes.
illegal drugs, and it governs the legal drugs, which it also governs the informal way that we drug ourselves. And the fog machine, such a great image that you mentioned, that television serves the purpose of fogging us in.
Keep
Neptune
us
governs,
numb, keep us dead.
yeah, numb us out. Neptune governs literal fog, and it governs all the drugs, and it governs the idea of staggering around in a numbed out state. But Neptune is the governor of Pisces. So the fine line between using Neptune that way and using it as a sensitivity, an advocate for more sensitivity to the point of spiritual sensitivity, that fine line is something that all of us are going to be walking during this Piscean period, meaning that we're being challenged to get into the higher vibration of Neptune and to avoid, like the plague, the lower expression of Neptune. Very difficult to do. It's the same planet. Neptune in Pisces is in its strongest placement it could ever be in. And all the other Pisces planets are supporting it, making this one archetype really dominant. And it's going to force each of us in our own way, depending on what we've got going on in our charts, to either move into the emotional sophistication we were talking about earlier, whereby your own personal feelings start to merge with understandings that are not just personal, but universal. So that's why it supports spiritual understanding. Between that and the kind of lowest common denominator version of Neptune, which is the escapism, which is just rampant. I mean, if it's not alcohol and prescription drugs, it's sleep And depression, too, is a kind of, it's governed by Neptune, too, because it's a kind of a shutting down out of overwhelm. And overeating and, self-medication. I think that what's happened, since I wrote my first book and I looked at this question to now, 6 years, 7 years later, self-medication like this has become normative.
Mm-hmm.
It was the exception before. Now it's the rule in the USA and Europe. I just read that a quarter of American women age 40 to 59 take antidepressants.
Well, one of the things that shocked me when I moved to the States, and I could say lots of things that shock me about the UK and other countries, so I'm not picking on the US, but one of the things that shocked me about the US is that everybody knows the brand names and refers to the brand names of certain drugs. And people would say, "Oh, would you maybe you should have some Lunesta?" Or and I was like, "Well, what is Lunesta?" And it just shocked me that
Right.
everybody's like part of the language. Everyone knows the name of the
Well, it
drugs.
certainly tells us, it's a sign of how much money goes into the advertising.
Hmm. That's
These
true. That's true.
beautiful, glossy ads that you see, that no expense was spared to present those high-priced pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, well,
That it's,
Jessica,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry,
No,
I
you
didn't mean
go.
to interrupt you. I was just excited because we talked about piggy bank, and I want to ask you then if I would like to see the pharmaceutical industry come under the spotlight and held accountable.
Yeah.
But my question for you is, as we see all of these planets moving into Pisces, will we be talking about piggy prescription? Do you feel
Hmm.
that that's the next scandal to break?
I do. I have been sniffing this out for a while now because, the Pluto effect is to flush out of hiding these plutocratic processes that have been undercover in our society. And of any industry, pharmaceuticals is one of the most plutocratic in the sense that they have the highest profit margin, I think, per unit of product. If you think of a tiny little pill that costs pennies to produce, a fraction of a penny to produce, and then sells for whatever they can get away with. So big pharma is really kind of epitomizes the rapacious greed of the big guys, the industries that are kind of the foundation of our plutocracy. And there's an interesting symbiotic relationship, that is never talked about in the official narrative between illegal drugs and legal drugs. I think that this is going to become more and more talked about. I think Pisces is going to stimulate controversy here because it's a kind of an unconscious theme floating around in the mass mind. And there's going to be a lot of reactivity, and idiots are going to be blathering on about nonsense. But there's also going to be some pointed questions asked, like you suggest. For example, the notion that the war on drugs, so-called, is not working. It's been a complete failure. It's cost trillions and trillions of dollars, right? This war on drugs and the wiping out of marijuana crops in Mendocino County. Meanwhile, there are geopolitical aspects which are staggeringly important to consider to the whole global economy, like the trafficking and selling of illegal drugs, which I think is probably the most stunning financial success story of our era. It's thought to be, $400 billion a year industry. And then, there's so many interesting things about this that people will start to ask if they just follow the dots and keep looking. They will find, that it's not a new idea, but I think it'll be talked about more and more, that the violent sales networks, for the drugs that are destroying Mexico, And, civilization as we know it in Latin America is really hanging in the balance from these networks, but they exist to satisfy demand up north. In the
Yeah, well, I
USA,
find
a
it fascinating
putatively
to
civilized country.
reflect upon Greece and Latin America. So we know about the Mayans and Peru, all these wonderful
Yeah,
civilizations and monuments in Latin America, and then we know about the heritage of Greece, and I find it just so symbolic that Greece is the country in Europe that's been collapsing
that's
economically or
right.
collapsing the most.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it really is.
right. And this notion of civilization, too, that you bring up, Stephen, the sign Capricorn in astrology is associated with this whole notion of civilization. And, Pluto is in Capricorn. Since 2008, the planet of complete breakdown and renewal, which only happens every 2.5 centuries, is in the sign of civilization. So it's not just that these different crises are happening in these different countries. From the big picture point of view, it's the whole concept of civilization, which is crumbling in the group mind. And by that I mean that our definition of what is civilized is what's transforming. So I think that's the astrologer's answer for why it had to be Greece.
It's just
You see what I mean? Because
nothing's
it
per
epitomizes
chance.
something, and that something is going through a sea change.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, I want to ask you about children. I'm blown away by the accuracy of astrology, and I love hearing what you have to say. And I think about natal charts and individuals, and the fact that children being born are coming into a very different world, but they're coming in with very different charts.
Right.
What do the charts of children being born now tell
Mm.
us about where we are and maybe where we need to go?
Well, as an old fogey, I am in an interesting position to comment on such a thing as, for example, what's the term? There's a new term that's been coined, cybernatives. This isn't the infants, but little babies that have been born since 1993 is when astrology pegs the milestone, because it was when Uranus conjuncted Neptune in the sky. And we see that as kind of the inauguration of the era of when computers became not just a peculiarity and a side issue anymore, but became absolutely central to public life. And so children born since then, and even more children born since the Uranus-Pluto square within the post-cyber era, I believe that they're neurologically wired differently. And many people talk about this, especially geezers like me, that the young people, it's not just that they know how to work these things. We always have to ask them when our machines break down, and they always know. It's not just that they know the skills, it's that their minds are wired differently.
Well,
I'm
Jessica,
thinking a
you
lot
read my
about...
mind completely, because the question I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you is just that. I was going to say to you, do technological developments change the way we function internally as well as what we're doing
Mm.
externally? So you've
Well, I think that the neurologists are just beginning to look into this. They tell you that the brains of people who grew up in a cyber world are wired differently. But we can see sociologically the huge changes, just the way of raising a generation of babies who, well, this is a pet peeve, so, but as an example, the number of mothers who are pushing and fathers who are pushing their baby carriages down the street and they're yakking on a cell phone. And you know, there's this kind of lack of ambient awareness that goes on when in a world where the cell phone has sort of broken down the division between private space and public space. You know, it's become permissible and completely normative to have a loud conversation on the bus on your cell phone. So a lot of different changes have happened, and when I think of a child growing up in that kind of with that kind of a parental relationship where the prioritization of this disembodied voice on the phone instead of pointing out to your child all the little things about the walk you're taking together, makes me very sad.
Well, because again, it's the theme of purity of presence and
Right.
being conscious. Well, Jessica, we're almost out of time, and I could speak to you forever, but I want to ask you, for our listeners, where, when, and how do they find out more about your work and what you're going to be doing this year?
Well, you know, my website is the headquarters. It's mothersky.com, MOTHERSKY, no space. And I write a blog about the key things that are going on in the world, a monthly blog about the things which grab the headlines. And we try to talk about the meaning behind them, the larger picture of what they mean. And I also have a Sky Watch every month that people can subscribe to. And that talks about what transits are going on and how they might affect our natal charts. And I also have a lecture series. There's just no dearth of information out there.
It's wonderful. Well, Jessica, I don't know how to thank you enough. I want to say to you, and I mean this very genuinely, you're one of the very few people that have really woken me up. And I know that you're waking a lot of people up and having a big influence. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so very much, Stephen.
And keep up the good work. We love it. Can't get enough
of
it.
All right. Back
Okay.
at you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.